The wind howled across the plains of Eastern Europe, carrying with it the ghostly echoes of horse hooves and war cries that once shook the world. For nearly 2 centuries, the Mongols had been the living embodiment of unstoppable power, an empire forged in fire and blood, stretching from the frozen rivers of Russia to the mountains of Persia and the rice fields of China. They were called the Scourge of God, men who moved faster than storms, who burned cities before sunrise and vanished before sunset. And yet, there came a day, an almost unthinkable day, when the might of Europe would finally turn the tide, when the so-called invincible Mongols would meet their match not in strength, but in endurance, strategy, and the slow decay of their own monstrous empire. To understand how Europe destroyed the invincible Mongols, one must begin with fear, the kind of fear that silenced kings and emptied entire towns. It began in 1241, when the armies of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, thundered into Europe. The Mongols had already obliterated everything in their path: Persia, Georgia, Kievan Rus, and Poland. At the Battle of Legnica, they annihilated a coalition of German, Polish, and Templar knights as if they were children with sticks. Days later, Hungary was engulfed in flames. The Mongols had crossed rivers that were supposed to protect Europe, destroyed armies that were supposed to stop them, and mocked the gods of men who prayed for salvation. But the secret to their power was not mere brutality, it was intelligence and organization. Every Mongol campaign was planned with mathematical precision. Their generals communicated through an intricate system of flags, horns, and mounted messengers. They carried mobile forges to repair weapons on the move, and their horses, small, sturdy, tireless, gave them unmatched mobility. When Europeans saw Mongol cavalry advance in perfect formation, they saw not men, but a force of nature. Cities like Kiev, Krakow, and Pest fell within days. Survivors spoke of black smoke that covered the sky, of catapults that hurled corpses into fortresses to spread plague, of arrows that rained like metal hail. For the first time, Europe trembled not from within, but from an enemy unlike any it had ever known. And yet, amidst the terror, something unexpected began to form. While the Mongols had perfected the art of rapid conquest, Europe began learning the art of survival. The survivors studied Mongol tactics, noted their weaknesses, and quietly prepared. The Mongols were unbeatable in open battle, but Europe's forests, mountains, and marshes were not the wide, dry plains of Central Asia. In the dense woods of Poland and the swamps of Hungary, horses stumbled, arrows lost their range, and the lightning-fast communication of Mongol units began to falter. The further they advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Then came the first turning point. In 1242, Batu Khan's armies suddenly withdrew from Europe, right when total conquest seemed inevitable. The reason? The death of the great Khan Ogday in Karakoram. By Mongol law, all princes had to return home to elect a new ruler. Europe, saved by fate rather than strength, breathed again, but the scars remained. In the decades that followed, Europe rebuilt with a new purpose. Kings who once squabbled over borders now fortified castles, built alliances, and restructured armies to resist future invasions. They learned from the enemy. Knights trained to fight not just in glorious single combat but in coordinated formations. Fortresses were designed with deeper moats, stronger gates, and high towers for archers. Meanwhile, within the Mongol Empire, cracks began to appear. After the death of Genghis Khan's heirs, the vast realm split into rival khanates. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each ruler claimed to be the true heir of Genghis Khan, but all distrusted one another. Once united under one supreme purpose, the Mongols were now drifting apart, politically, culturally, and spiritually. By the late 13th century, Europe had recovered enough to resist. The Crusader states had fallen, but Europe's knights had gained valuable experience fighting in distant lands. They now faced the Mongols not as terrified peasants, but as trained warriors. The Mongol armies that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands were now fractured. When the Golden Horde turned its eyes once again toward Europe, it was not the same world it had once terrorized. The kingdoms of Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania had forged alliances, strengthened their defenses, and adopted new weapons like the crossbow, a weapon deadly even against Mongol armor. The tide was beginning to shift. But the true destruction of Mongol power would not come from battles alone. It would come from within, from disease, division, and the slow collapse of their own monstrous creation. The Black Death swept through Eurasia in the mid-14th century, devastating both Mongol and European populations. Ironically, it was likely the Mongols who helped spread it, catapulting infected corpses into besieged cities like Kaffa on the Black Sea. From there, the plague spread westward, killing millions. For the Mongols, the pandemic shattered their armies and decimated their horses. Their vast communication network, once the veins of the empire, began to die. Europe suffered terribly, but it also adapted. When the plague faded, European cities were smaller but more organized. Trade networks shifted westward, bypassing the old Silk Road that had once fed Mongol wealth. The empires of the steppe were bleeding out economically, while Europe was entering the dawn of the Renaissance, a rebirth of thought, technology, and power. By the 15th century, the Invincible Mongols were no longer the world's terror but its memory. Yet remnants remained. The Golden Horde still ruled over parts of Russia and Eastern Europe, enforcing tribute and slavery. It seemed that while the Mongols were fading, their shadow still stretched long across the land. But a new force was rising in the north, one that would strike the final blow. That force was Muscovy, led by men who had once been the Mongols, obedient servants but were now preparing to turn against them. Europe, once trampled beneath Mongol hooves, was about to become the hunter. The winter of 1380 was unlike any other. Across the frozen steppes, a vast army gathered under a crimson banner, the forces of the Golden Horde. For generations, they had ruled over the Rus lands, demanding tribute and obedience. But this time, they faced a rebellion led by a man who would become a legend, Prince Dmitry Ivanovich of Moscow, later known as Dmitry Donskoy. For centuries, the Mongols had divided the Russian princes, forcing them to compete for the Khan's favor. It was a brilliant tactic, divide and rule. But the arrogance of the Mongol elite had grown, and the fire of resistance was spreading. The princes of Rus, once bowed and broken, began to whisper of unity, of vengeance, of a day when the horde would fall. That day came at Kulikovo Field. The Mongols, led by the ruthless Mamai, marched west with tens of thousands of seasoned warriors. They expected the same easy victory as their ancestors had always enjoyed. Instead, they found the Russians waiting, not as scattered rivals, but as one united army. The battle that followed was brutal, bloody, and chaotic. The Mongols' arrows darkened the sky, but the Russians held firm. Dmitry himself fought in the thick of the melee, his armor dented, his horse slain beneath him. When the dust finally settled, the impossible had happened, the Mongol army was broken. Though not the end of Mongol domination, the Battle of Kulikovo was the beginning of the end. It was proof that the horde could be beaten, that their aura of invincibility was just a myth. Across Europe, word spread, the Mongols had been defeated on their own terms, in open battle. But even as Dmitry celebrated, the real death of Mongol power was unfolding in slow motion. The Golden Horde was tearing itself apart. Rival Khans fought for control, while new enemies rose from every side. The Timurids attacked from Central Asia, the Lithuanians from the west, and the rising Ottoman Empire from the south. Europe, meanwhile, was changing faster than the steppe could comprehend. Gunpowder had arrived. Castles that once fell to flaming arrows now withstood bombardments. Knights gave way to disciplined armies of musketeers and artillery. The Mongols, masters of the bow and horse, were suddenly facing a new world where their greatest weapons meant little. By the 15th century, the once mighty Golden Horde had splintered into smaller khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and Sibir. They still raided, still demanded tribute, but they were shadows of their former glory. And from the forests of the north, the Grand Duchy of Moscow was rising higher and higher, consolidating power, building fortresses, and preparing to cast off the Mongol yoke once and for all. In 1480, the moment finally came. The armies of Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, met those of the great Khan Ahmad at the Ugra River. For days, the two sides stared across the water, neither willing to commit to battle. The standoff became known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. And then, just like that, the Mongols withdrew. No great battle, no dramatic slaughter. The horde had lost its will to fight. Europe had outlasted them. That silent retreat marked the end of Mongol domination in Europe. Ivan III declared himself the sovereign ruler of a free Russia, and the Mongol tribute system was abolished. The empire that once ruled from Korea to Hungary was gone. But the Mongols' legacy didn't vanish, it transformed. Their roads became the arteries of global trade. Their tactics influenced generations of generals. Even their destruction shaped Europe's destiny. For in resisting the Mongols, Europe had been forced to unify, to innovate, and to evolve. The castles, alliances, and technologies that would later fuel the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration all had roots in those desperate years of survival. The irony of history is cruel. The Mongols had once connected the world, trade, culture, and ideas flowed freely across their empire. But it was Europe, once their victim, that would inherit that global network. In the centuries that followed, European ships would sail to Asia not in fear, but in conquest. The world that Genghis Khan had opened was now Europe's to dominate. By the dawn of the 16th century, the last Mongol Khanates were little more than regional powers, their territories slowly absorbed by Russia and the Ottomans. The empire that once seemed immortal had dissolved into dust. And so, Europe's victory over the Mongols was not one great battle or one brilliant general. It was patience, adaptation, and endurance. The Mongols could destroy kingdoms in a week, but Europe could rebuild for centuries. The horsemen of the steppe were fast, but the continent they sought to conquer was vast, stubborn, and full of men who refused to die quietly. The Invincible Mongols were not defeated by swords or arrows, but by time itself, and by a continent that learned how to turn fear into strength. By the time the last Khan fell, Europe stood ready to claim the world.